If you called someone useless today, only to find out tomorrow that they secretly own everything you brag about, how would you react? The restaurant buzzed with the kind of energy only the wealthy could afford. Dim golden lights cast a warm glow over crystal glasses and pristine white tablecloths. Laughter, soft jazz, and the clinking of champagne flutes filled the air. At the center of it all sat Sandra, the newly crowned queen of luxury, basking in the attention of her elite circle. She looked every bit the role, draped in a shimmering red designer dress, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she lifted her glass. Her nails, perfectly manicured in a shade of deep crimson, tapped lightly against the glass as she flashed a triumphant smile at her guests. They were celebrating her victory, as they called it. "Ladies," she purred, tilting her head, "to new beginnings and knowing when to let go of the past." Laughter rippled around the table. Someone whispered something about Leonard's ex-wife, Aisha, and the table erupted into giggles. "She never belonged in this world," one of the women said, shaking her head. "She didn't have the class, the charm, or the ambition." Sandra smirked, sipping her champagne. "She didn't have Leonard either, in the end." As if on cue, the grand entrance doors swung open, and a soft hush spread through the room. A woman walked in, Aisha. The air seemed to shift. Aisha moved with quiet confidence, dressed in a simple but elegant ivory dress that hugged her figure in all the right places. No excessive jewelry, no desperate attempt to flaunt wealth, just grace and presence. A few people at nearby tables stole glances at her, some whispering, others just watching. Sandra's eyes narrowed. "Speak of the devil," she murmured, leaning back at her chair. Aisha didn't look around, didn't scan the room like someone seeking approval. She simply walked over to the bar, gave the bartender a nod, and took a seat. It was as if she hadn't even noticed Sandra. That irritated Sandra. Lifting her glass dramatically, she turned to her friends and, in a voice loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby, said, Well, look who decided to join civilization. What's next, Aisha? You're applying for a job as a waitress." The table erupted in laughter. A few guests at other tables turned to watch. The show had begun. Aisha finally looked over, her dark eyes calm, unreadable. Sandra made a tisk-tisk sound. "I almost didn't recognize you without your apron and grocery bags. How is life after Leonard, dear? Rough, I assume." Aisha held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable before offering the tiniest smile. "Not at all." Sandra arched a brow. "No, I assumed losing everything would leave a person, well, struggling. I mean, when Leonard and I moved into our house, I couldn't help but feel sorry for you. But then again, you never really belonged in that world, did you?" The laughter around the table grew louder. Aisha remained silent, her face unreadable. Then, with an eerie calmness, she said, "You only have what I allowed you to have." Sandra blinked. Then she laughed. "Oh, that's rich. That's actually rich." She clapped her hands together, looking around as if waiting for others to join in. "You allowed me to have everything? Sweetheart, Leonard handed me your life on a silver platter. You had no say in it. I took what I wanted, and you were nothing but an obstacle that got out of the way." Aisha tilted her head slightly, her expression one of mild amusement. "If that's what you believe." Sandra let out a loud sigh and leaned forward. "Honestly, Aisha, I almost feel bad for you. But that's life, isn't it? Some people win. Some people disappear into nothing." Aisha didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even blink. She simply smiled. And that smile, it sent a chill down Sandra's spine. The kind of smile someone wears when they know a secret. Sandra was about to say something else when the waiter arrived with the bill. He placed the elegant leather folder in front of Sandra. "Your bill, madam." Sandra waved a hand dismissively. "Leonard will settle it. Just put it on our account." The waiter hesitated. "Actually, ma'am, it's already been arranged." Sandra frowned. "Excuse me." The waiter carefully opened the folder and slid the bill slightly toward her. It was settled under the owner's account. Sandra glanced down lazily, still half smirking, until her eyes landed on the name at the top of the receipt. Aisha King, owner. The air vanished from Sandra's lungs. For the first time that evening, she had no words. The blood drained from her face as she stared at the name. The name that should not be there. The name that should have been erased. "No," Sandra said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up slowly, as if needing confirmation that this was a joke. But Aisha wasn't laughing. She simply watched Sandra, calm, patient, expectant. Sandra's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. What kind of mistake is this?" The waiter shifted uncomfortably. "No mistake, ma'am. The account is under Ms. King's ownership." "Ms. King." Sandra's head snapped back toward Aisha, who hadn't moved an inch. "No," Sandra said, louder this time, shaking her head as if trying to physically reject reality. "That's impossible. Leonard owns everything." Aisha smiled politely. "Does he?" Sandra felt the room spin. Her friends, once laughing, had fallen completely silent. Some of them exchanged glances. Others looked down awkwardly, pretending not to witness Sandra's humiliation unfold in real time. Sandra gripped her wine glass so tightly that she nearly shattered it. This is a joke," she said, forcing a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Leonard he wouldn't let you." "Are you sure?" Aisha interrupted, her voice gentle. Sandra opened her mouth, then closed it. Leonard hadn't been himself lately. He had been tense, quiet, constantly checking his phone, leaving the house for business meetings, and coming home late without an explanation. And then there were the papers, the documents Sandra wasn't allowed to touch. Her hands began to tremble. Aisha stood up, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "You might want to check who truly holds the cards, Sandra." Sandra's throat tightened. This couldn't be happening. Aisha gave a polite nod, turned, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Sandra just sat there, staring at the bill in front of her, her own reflection looking back at her from the polished surface of the table. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The laughter and whispers of her so-called friends felt distant, like an echo from another world. The confidence she had felt just minutes ago, gone. And for the first time since she had taken Leonard from Aisha, a terrifying thought crept into Sandra's mind. What if she hadn't won after all? Sandra laughs, but then a waiter accidentally hands her a bill, addressed to Aisha King, owner. "Wait, before we go any further, let's make a deal. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, show some love. Tap that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And don't keep this to yourself. Share it with someone who loves a good story. All right, ready? Let's get back to it." Sandra sat frozen, the weight of the restaurant scene still pressing against her chest. The name on the bill, Aisha King, owner, echoed in her mind like an unsolvable riddle. But before she could unravel its meaning, before she could make sense of Aisha's parting words, her thoughts dragged her backward, to the beginning of it all. It started with charm. Sweet, undeniable charm. Leonard had been an easy target. A successful businessman, confident but predictable. Sandra had spotted him long before he noticed her, analyzing his every move, his weaknesses, his frustrations. She had been working in an exclusive art gallery when he first stepped in, accompanied by Aisha. Aisha had been dressed simply, no designer labels, no extravagant jewelry, just grace and elegance that didn't try too hard. A quiet presence, one that could be overlooked in a room full of louder personalities. Sandra had smiled then, watching from a distance. "That's your mistake, Aisha. You make it too easy." The plan had been effortless. She had studied Leonard's frustrations, his long sighs, his distracted nods when Aisha spoke, the way his eyes wandered when something exciting passed by. Sandra had made sure she became that something exciting. A coincidental meeting at a charity event. A lingering conversation about art. A playful compliment. It had been enough to plant a seed of curiosity in Leonard's mind. Sandra played her role well, always listening, always agreeing at just the right moments. She wasn't like Aisha, who questioned his choices, who challenged his ideas. No, Sandra was a breath of fresh air. She made him feel important, admired, unstoppable. The affair began subtly. A stolen glance here, a hand brushing against his there. Then, one night at a business gala, Sandra had leaned in just a little too close, whispered something just a little too suggestive, and that was it. Leonard had fallen. Hard. The moment she had him, Sandra knew she had to act fast. Aisha was loyal, but loyalty alone wasn't enough to keep a man entertained. Sandra had made sure Aisha saw glimpses of the betrayal. A lipstick stain on Leonard's collar. A suspicious message left open on his phone. A carefully timed phone call when she knew Aisha was near. Doubt is a dangerous seed, and Sandra knew exactly how to water it. And just like that, the marriage crumbled. Leonard didn't fight to keep it. Aisha walked away with her dignity, leaving Sandra victorious. For months after, Sandra basked in her triumph. She moved into Leonard's house, a mansion too grand for Aisha's simple tastes, but perfect for Sandra. It became her kingdom. She redecorated, hosted lavish parties, made connections with the city's elite. No more watching from the sidelines. She was the woman of the house now. The transformation was glorious. Where Aisha had been quiet, Sandra was bold. She filled the house with laughter, music, and extravagance. Fashion designers sent her gifts, socialites invited her to exclusive gatherings, and paparazzi snapped photos of her draped in the finest silks and diamonds. Sandra spent like there was no tomorrow. If she wanted it, she had it. Champagne brunches, private shopping sprees, expensive vacations. Every dream she had ever imagined was now her reality. But then came the letter. It arrived on a Monday morning as Sandra lounged by the pool, sipping on an imported fruit smoothie. Her assistant, Mia, handed her the envelope. "It's addressed to Aisha," she said, confused. "Should I return it?" Sandra scoffed. "Aisha? What does she have to do with anything anymore?" She tore open the envelope, half expecting it to be some leftover nonsense from Aisha's past life. But as her eyes scanned the letter, her fingers tightened around the edges. It was legal paperwork, and Aisha's name wasn't just on the envelope. It was on everything. Sandra's breath hitched as she read the words carefully. Property ownership confirmation, registered owner, Aisha King. Her hands trembled. No, this can't be right. Sandra sat up, her mind racing. Aisha had left. Leonard had chosen her. She had won. So why was Aisha's name still attached to anything? Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and dialed Leonard. He answered on the third ring, sounding tired. "What is it, Sandra?" Sandra's voice came out sharper than intended. "I just got a letter, a legal one. It says Aisha still owns this house." Silence. Sandra's heart pounded harder. "Leonard," a slow sigh. Then, a carefully worded response. "We need to talk." Sandra stood abruptly, the world around her shifting. Talk. What was there to talk about? Panic bubbled in her chest. Aisha's last words at the restaurant returned to haunt her. "You only have what I allowed you to have." Had it been a warning? Sandra swallowed hard, gripping the letter so tightly that the edges crumpled. She had spent months relishing her win, parading through the city like a queen. But now, a single piece of paper had unraveled everything. Had she won it all? And worse, had she ever truly known the rules of the game she was playing? Sandra stormed through the grand hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Every step echoed her fury. The legal letters still clutched in her hand felt like a ticking time bomb. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors to Leonard's study without knocking. He was sitting behind his grand oak desk, his fingers tapping against his temple, deep in thought. Papers were scattered in front of him, but he didn't even flinch at Sandra's dramatic entrance. "We need to talk. Now." Leonard finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Sandra, not now." She slammed the letter onto his desk. "Then when? Because I just received legal paperwork that says Aisha is the owner of this house. Tell me this is some sort of mistake." Leonard sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's complicated." Sandra's eyes widened. "Complicated? You told me this was yours. You let me believe this was ours. Now, suddenly, Aisha's name is still on things? I need answers." Leonard rubbed his forehead. "Sandra, you don't understand." "Oh, trust me, I understand just fine," Sandra cut in. "You lied to me." His jaw clenched, and for the first time, Sandra saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, fear. Leonard King, the powerful businessman, the man who had discarded his wife for her, looked afraid. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then she noticed it. The way his desk, usually a model of order, was a complete mess. Files pulled out, notes scribbled frantically, financial reports spread across the surface. And then there was the envelope, a thick, expensive one, sealed with an official-looking stamp. Sandra's fingers twitched. Whatever was inside, it was important. Leonard saw her looking. He moved the envelope aside and stood up. I need to handle this. Just trust me. Trust you. Sandra scoffed. After this, you're hiding something. Leonard didn't deny it. Instead, he simply exhaled sharply and walked past her, leaving the study. Sandra stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. He was avoiding her. That meant there was more, something bigger. In the days that followed, Leonard's behavior changed. He became distracted, distant. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Meetings behind closed doors. Sandra tried to ask questions, but he always brushed her off. Then, the strangers started arriving. First, it was a well-dressed man with a briefcase. A banker, judging by his stiff posture and the way he adjusted his tie every few minutes. He left after an hour, his face grim. Next came the lawyers. 2 of them. They spent an entire afternoon in Leonard's study, their voices low and serious. When Sandra walked past, she caught bits of the conversation. Still in her name, no transfer of ownership. You can't sell what you don't own. Sandra's stomach twisted. Aisha's name again. And then, the most unsettling visit of all, a woman. Not just any woman. An older, graceful woman with silver-streaked hair, sharp eyes, and an air of quiet authority. Sandra watched from the staircase as Leonard greeted her. There was no warmth, only tension. The woman barely glanced at him before stepping inside. They disappeared into the study, and the door shut firmly behind them. Sandra's curiosity burned. Who was she? Why did Leonard look so uneasy? She tiptoed closer, pressing her ear against the door. Never yours to give. Sandra's breath caught. Leonard's voice, quieter. I assumed. No, the woman's voice was firm. You assumed wrong. The house, the stocks, the assets. None of it was yours to give. It all belongs to her. Sandra's heart pounded in her chest. Her fingers curled into fists. Her? Aisha? She gasped before she could stop herself. Inside, the voices went silent. Had they heard her? The door suddenly creaked open, and Sandra stumbled back. Leonard stepped out first, his face pale. Then, the older woman followed, her sharp gaze locking onto Sandra like a hawk spotting its prey. You must be Sandra, the woman said smoothly. I was just telling Leonard here how messy things can get when people don't understand what truly belongs to them. Sandra swallowed hard. Who are you? The woman gave a knowing smile. I represent the interests of the true owner of this house. Sandra's pulse quickened. And you mean, Aisha? The woman tilted her head. You'll find out soon enough. Without another word, she walked away, leaving Sandra standing there, breathless, unsure, and for the first time since she had taken Aisha's place, afraid. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. The woman's words echoed in her mind. Leonard hadn't spoken much after the meeting. He had gone to bed early, leaving her to stew in her own thoughts. Sandra sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring at the dim glow of the city lights through the window. She was used to luxury, used to power, used to being in control. But suddenly, everything felt uncertain. She stood and walked through the house, the grand halls that had once felt like her kingdom, now feeling foreign. None of it was yours to give. Sandra's fingers trailed along the walls. Had Aisha really never let go? Had she been watching all along, waiting for this moment? She needed answers. Sandra sat stiffly in the dimly lit study, the glow from Leonard's laptop screen reflecting off her tense face. The silence between them was thick with unspoken accusations. Leonard's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation flickering in his eyes. He had always been confident, always certain. But now, he looked like a man unraveling. She couldn't have hidden all this from me, Leonard muttered under his breath, clicking through financial records. I would have known. Sandra crossed her arms, her nails digging into her skin. Clearly you didn't. She leaned forward as Leonard scrolled through spreadsheets, account statements, and property documents. Page after page, Aisha's name kept appearing. On real estate holdings, on investment accounts, on legal filings that trace back years. There were properties in different districts, high-end apartments, commercial spaces. Even an entire building registered under her name. "This isn't possible," Leonard murmured. "How? When?" Sandra's heart pounded as she spotted something that made her stomach twist. A company name intertwined with King Enterprises. She snatched the mouse from Leonard's grip and clicked deeper. The company was called Ashbourne Holdings. Leonard blinked. That's one of my business partners. Sandra's breath came out in a slow exhale. "No, it's not." She clicked through ownership details and there it was. Aisha King, primary stakeholder. Leonard shot up from his chair, pacing across the room. "This can't be real. She never even asked about my business, never showed interest." "How could she?" Sandra interrupted. "Maybe that was the plan all along." Leonard shook his head. "No, Aisha was." He stopped himself. "Was what?" Sandra pressed. "A pushover? A nobody?" Leonard remained silent. Sandra scoffed. "Face it, Leonard. She played you. The whole time, she wasn't just sitting at home waiting for you. She was building something. And somehow, she managed to keep you completely blind to it." Leonard ran a hand through his hair, frustration radiating off him. "I need to know more. There has to be something we're missing." Sandra wasn't convinced they were missing anything. Aisha had moved in silence, leaving no room for doubt. But still, she needed to understand how deep this went. Flashback, Aisha's past. Years ago, Aisha sat across from her grandmother, Miriam Sani, in the grand living room of an estate that reeked of old money. The elder woman's sharp eyes studied Aisha carefully. "You are patient," Miriam finally said, sipping her tea. "That is good." Aisha nodded, waiting. "But patience alone is not power," her grandmother continued. "A smart woman does not need to be loud to be strong. She moves in shadows, builds where no one looks, and when the time is right." Miriam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "She is the one holding the keys." Aisha absorbed her words, her mind already crafting a path. Most people believed she had married Leonard because she loved him. That was true at first, but she had also seen his ambition, his hunger for success. And while he fought his way into the business world, she made moves of her own, quietly, carefully. While Leonard negotiated deals, Aisha learned to understand finances. While he spent lavishly to impress people, she invested. While he built an empire he believed was his, she secured the foundation beneath it. And she never made the mistake of putting everything in his name. Because Miriam had taught her better. "You must always have your own," Miriam had warned. Because when the world decides to forget a woman's worth, she must remind them. Aisha never forgot those words. Present day, Sandra and Leonard dug deeper into the records, each discovery making the air heavier between them. Every time they thought they had reached the bottom, something else emerged. There were businesses Aisha had invested in years before Leonard even met Sandra. Land acquisitions that had quietly multiplied in value. Stocks in companies that had merged with King Enterprises. It wasn't that Aisha had taken anything from Leonard. It was that Leonard had never truly owned it. Sandra felt a cold chill run down her spine. She wasn't just a housewife. Leonard stared at the screen, silent. "She was running the game before you even realized you were a player," Sandra said. Leonard slumped back into his chair, exhaling heavily. "I underestimated her." Sandra scoffed. "You ignored her." And that was his biggest mistake. Leonard's voice was barely above a whisper. "What does she want now?" That was the question lingering in the air, heavy with uncertainty. If Aisha had all of this, why had she waited? Why had she allowed Leonard and Sandra to believe they had won? Sandra's stomach twisted. Aisha wasn't just reclaiming what was hers. She was setting something up, something bigger, and they had no idea what was coming next. Sandra stormed into the quiet cafe where Aisha sat, her every movement laced with barely contained rage. The once glamorous socialite, now desperate and teetering on the edge of losing everything, felt the weight of the world pressing against her chest. She had chosen this place intentionally, private enough to avoid public humiliation, yet not secluded enough for Aisha to ignore her completely. Aisha, in contrast, appeared calm, sipping her tea as though she had all the time in the world. She barely acknowledged Sandra's presence, only glancing up briefly before setting her cup down with a soft clink. "You need to fix this," Sandra hissed, gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Whatever game you're playing, it stops now." Aisha tilted her head slightly, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Game," she echoed. "I didn't realize I was playing one." Sandra scoffed, her frustration boiling over. "Leonard built this empire. You were just a housewife. You don't get to take everything from him." Aisha finally gave her full attention, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I never took anything," she said smoothly. "I just never let him take it from me." Sandra's breath hitched. There was something chilling in Aisha's words, in the quiet certainty of them. She shook her head. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you don't know how things work now. This isn't the past where women hide in the shadows." Aisha smiled. "Exactly. The fall begins." Sandra stormed out of the cafe, her heart racing. She needed to do damage control. People needed to believe that Leonard was still in control, that they were still at the top. But the city had already started whispering. The socialites who once clung to Sandra's side now watched her with calculating eyes. Invitations stopped arriving. Business partners hesitated. Rumors swirled like wildfire. Leonard was losing everything. And worse, Aisha was the reason why. Sandra felt the shift when she walked into the country club she once ruled. Conversations stopped. People exchanged glances. When she approached a group of women she used to dine with, they barely acknowledged her. "Is everything all right?" She forced a smile. One of them, Grace, hesitated before answering. "We heard things are difficult right now." Sandra stiffened. "Difficult?" Another woman, Elise, sipped her wine. "Bank freezes, canceled deals, people talk, Sandra." Sandra clenched her jaw. "People should mind their own business." Elise only shrugged. "That's hard to do when Leonard's business affects so many." It was a slap in the face. These women, who had once hung on her every word, were now distancing themselves. She had spent years climbing to the top of this world, and now it was slipping through her fingers. A crumbling empire. At home, Sandra found Leonard hunched over his desk, his usually sharp suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. He looked like a man drowning. "We need to do something," she said, slamming a stack of documents on his desk. "Do you realize what's happening? We're losing everything." Leonard barely lifted his head. "I know." Sandra's frustration boiled over. "Then fix it." Leonard laughed bitterly. "You think I haven't tried? You think I don't know what's happening?" Sandra froze. There was something in his voice, defeat. He leaned back in his chair. "I thought I was in control, Sandra. I thought I was the one making moves. But Aisha, she was always 10 steps ahead." Sandra shook her head. No, this isn't about her being smart. This is about you being weak." Leonard let out another humorless laugh. "And yet, you still followed me. You thought you won when Aisha left, but she never truly left, did she? She was always there, watching, waiting." Sandra's stomach twisted. "We can fight this." Leonard rubbed his temples. "Fight with what? The banks are freezing our accounts. Investors are pulling out. Every major deal I had lined up has fallen apart. And do you want to know the worst part?" Sandra didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Leonard let out a deep breath. "She never had to do anything. She just had to wait for me to fall apart on my own." Sandra's blood ran cold. The final blow. The next morning, Sandra sat in the grand living room of the house she once proudly called her own. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, but for the first time, the space felt foreign. Then the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a man in a crisp suit standing on the doorstep, holding a stack of legal documents. "Mrs. King?" he asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. He handed her the papers. "This property is in the final stages of being legally reclaimed by Aisha King. You have until the end of the month to vacate." Sandra's vision blurred. "What?" The man nodded politely. "If you have any disputes, I suggest speaking with Mrs. King's legal team." Sandra didn't hear the rest. She slammed the door and turned, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Reclaimed. Not sold. Not transferred. Reclaimed. Because it had never truly belonged to Leonard. She sank onto the marble floor, the weight of her downfall finally crushing her. Sandra, once the mistress who thought she had won, realizes she was never more than a pawn in Aisha's quiet, calculated game. The morning air in Empire Bay carried a strange stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Sandra woke up to silence. No chattering staff, no breakfast being prepared, no calls from high society friends. A nagging sense of unease settled in her chest as she slipped on her robe and stepped into the hallway. Then the front door swung open. A team of movers, dressed in crisp uniforms, marched in with practiced efficiency. They didn't hesitate. They didn't knock. They simply got to work, lifting expensive furniture, rolling up lavish rugs, and carrying out boxes of luxury items. What is this? Sandra shrieked, rushing forward. A stern-looking man in a suit stepped in behind them, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. King," he said, "we're here to execute the legal transfer of this property back to its rightful owner." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Rightful owner? This is my house. The man didn't blink. Actually, it never was. The empire crumbles. 2 hours earlier, Leonard sat in his office, his face pale as he stared at the headlines flashing across the screen. King Industries files for bankruptcy. Ex-wife secretly acquires majority. Sharissa fall from grace. Leonard King loses everything. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the articles. Investors had pulled out. Contracts had been voided. Clients were severing ties. It was as if his entire empire had been an illusion, and now someone had pulled back the curtain. Aisha. It had been her all along. The office door burst open. His assistant, Michael, stood there, sweating. "Sir, it's over. The board just voted. They're removing you as CEO." Leonard swallowed hard. "No, that's impossible." Michael handed him a folder. "The shares, someone's been buying them for months. Quietly. Strategically. They own controlling interest now." Leonard flipped through the documents, his stomach sinking with each page. The name he was looking for wasn't there. Instead, a web of companies, shell corporations, and foreign investors were listed. But he knew who was behind them. Aisha. She had dismantled him without ever stepping into his office. The public humiliation. Sandra stood frozen as movers carried out the grand chandelier from the dining hall. The same one she had boasted about during every dinner party. The same chandelier under which she had toasted to her new life, to her victory over Aisha. "You can't just take everything," she screamed. "Leonard." Leonard stumbled in, looking 10 years older than he had the night before. His tie hung loose, his eyes sunken. "We need to talk," he muttered, pulling Sandra aside. She jerked her arm away. "What is happening? Fix this." Leonard let out a broken laugh. "There's nothing to fix." Sandra shook her head wildly. No. This is some mistake. We can fight it. We can." He exhaled long and slow. "Sandra, we lost." Her knees nearly buckled. "What do you mean lost?" Leonard ran a hand through his hair. "Aisha owns everything." Sandra's lips trembled. "But she left." Leonard gave her a sad, almost pitying look. "She never really left, did she?" The Queen's return. Aisha arrived at the mansion just as the last of the furniture was being loaded onto moving trucks. Dressed in a sleek, navy blue suit, she exuded an effortless confidence. Sandra's breath hitched as she stepped forward. "You planned this." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "No," she said simply. "I just never stopped playing the game." Leonard, desperate, took a step toward her. "Aisha, please. We can talk." Aisha's expression didn't change. "Talk. Like the way you talked to me when you replaced me." Leonard's face twisted with regret, but Aisha was already turning away, her attention shifting to Sandra. "You thought you took everything from me," Aisha said, her voice calm but firm. "But I never lost anything. I was just waiting for you to realize that you were never the one in control." Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because for the first time, she saw the truth. She had never been a queen. She had never even been a player. She had been nothing more than a pawn. And the game was over. Sandra paced inside the dimly lit penthouse suite, her nails digging into the fabric of her clutch. Her world had crumbled faster than she could comprehend. The empire she flaunted, the riches she bathed in, gone, swept away as if they were never hers to begin with. She could hear the faint hum of city life below, a cruel reminder that the world continued spinning, indifferent to her downfall. Leonard sat across from her, slumped in a chair, his face buried in his hands. The man who once ruled Empire Bay's business elite now looked like a shell of himself. His tailored suit was crumpled, his tie undone. For once, there were no assistants waiting on him, no reporters clamoring for his attention. The world had moved on. You knew, Sandra hissed, breaking the suffocating silence. You knew she still had control. Leonard let out a bitter chuckle, lifting his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with exhaustion. I didn't know how much. I thought I was smart, Sandra. I thought I was untouchable. Sandra scoffed. You thought. Her voice was sharp, accusatory. You used me, Leonard. You let me think I won while you still played her game. And now we've lost everything. Leonard gave a slow, tired nod. Yes, we have. Sandra clenched her jaw. No, she wasn't done yet. She refused to be. Desperate measures. Sandra stormed out of the suite and into the city's cold night air. She needed a way out, a way back. Her fall from grace had been public, humiliating, and absolute. Once, she had been the woman people envied. Now, the whispers followed her wherever she went. Did you hear? She's broke. She was never the real power behind Leonard. Was she? I heard she's been begging for investors. Sandra gritted her teeth as she entered the elevator of an upscale hotel. She wasn't about to be discarded like some outdated fashion trend. There was still one move left. A mysterious investor had expressed interest in financing a new venture for her, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim a piece of what she lost. And Sandra, ever the survivor, would take it. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped into the grand lobby of the Meridian Hotel. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the scent of expensive perfume and fresh lilies filling the air. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and walked toward the private lounge where her meeting was scheduled. She had one shot, the meeting. The restaurant was nearly empty, save for a private section tucked away in the back. Sandra arrived early, her nerves buzzing under her skin. This deal had to work. It was her only chance to stay in the game. A waiter led her to an elegant table set for two. A single glass of wine awaited her, deep red and inviting. She sat down, smoothing her dress, forcing herself to breathe. She had always been good at masking fear with confidence. Tonight would be no different. Then the door opened. Sandra looked up, her practiced smile fading instantly. Aisha King walked in, poised, effortless, completely in control. Sandra's grip on the wine glass tightened as Aisha slid into the seat across from her. She placed a sleek leather folder on the table and clasped her hands together. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. You're late, Aisha said smoothly. I own this deal too. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Of all the people in the world, it had to be her. Her mind raced, trying to grasp how Aisha had maneuvered herself into this position. Was there no escape? No way to outplay her? I don't understand, Sandra finally managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. You're not in business. You walked away. Aisha tilted her head slightly, amused. Did I? She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. You were so busy playing the role of the queen that you never bothered to check who was truly writing the rules. Sandra felt a chill creep down her spine. She had underestimated Aisha from the beginning. She had seen her as nothing more than a discarded wife, a relic of Leonard's past. But Aisha had been watching, waiting, pulling the strings in ways Sandra had never imagined. Sandra straightened her shoulders, refusing to show weakness. If you own this deal, she said carefully, then you must want something from me. Aisha's smile didn't waver. Perhaps. She tapped the leather folder in front of her. This is a proposal. One that will determine what happens next for you. Sandra hesitated before reaching for the folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first few lines. And then, her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about an investment. This was about control. Aisha was offering her a way back, but on Aisha's terms. Sandra snapped the folder shut and exhaled sharply. This is a way forward, Aisha interrupted, her tone light, almost playful. If you're smart, you'll take it. Sandra's hands curled into fists onto the table. She had spent her entire life clawing her way to the top, refusing to bow to anyone. And now, the woman she had once mocked, the woman she had stolen from, was offering her a lifeline, but at a cost. Sandra had a choice to make, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. Sandra sat in the cold, sterile office, her fingers gripping the pen as if it were a knife pressed against her throat. The contract lay open before her, Aisha's elegant signature already neatly in place. The decision was clear: walk away with nothing or sign away her pride and become an employee in the empire she once believed she ruled. Her chest tightened. Aisha had orchestrated this moment. Every setback, every humiliation, every loss had led Sandra here, to this seat, in this office, under her control. Sandra closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and signed. Aisha took the contract, scanned it briefly, then smiled. Welcome to the team. A harsh new reality. The next morning, Sandra arrived at the office building, a sleek glass structure towering over the city. It was once Leonard's headquarters. Now, it belonged to Aisha. The receptionist barely glanced at her before handing her a security badge. There was no fanfare, no warm welcome. Just another employee. Sandra swallowed her resentment and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, enclosing her in silence. She pressed the button for the executive floor, but the light didn't turn on. Instead, a different button was already glowing 3 floors below. Not an executive anymore. The doors opened to a bustling office space filled with cubicles. Phones rang, people typed furiously, voices murmured in quick conversations. No private office, no assistant, just a standard desk in the middle of a sea of employees. Sandra clenched her teeth. She had once walked through these halls as a queen. Now, she was just another name on the payroll. She sat down at her assigned desk, scanning the pile of documents waiting for her. Reports, budgets, contracts, work she had once dismissed as someone else's problem. Aisha had given her a lesson, and she had no choice but to learn it. The first test. 2 hours in her first day, an email popped up on her screen. Sandra, my office. Now, her stomach twisted. Aisha. She took the elevator up to the executive floor, where she used to have power. Now, every step felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Aisha sat at the massive desk, scanning a file. She didn't look up when Sandra entered. You missed a detail in the contract revision, Aisha said, flipping a page. A costly one. Sandra's nails dug into her palm. I'll fix it. Aisha finally looked up, her expression calm. Do you know why I put you here, Sandra? Sandra bit back a bitter response. To humiliate me? Aisha leaned back in her chair. To teach you. Sandra blinked. Teach me? You played the short game, Aisha said simply. You thought taking Leonard was a victory. You thought money meant power. But power isn't about what you take, it's about what you build. Sandra had no answer, because deep down, she knew Aisha was right. New struggles. Days turned into weeks, and Sandra found herself drowning in work. The tasks were relentless: negotiations, financial analysis, business development. She had spent years spending money, but now she had to understand it. She made mistakes. A lot of them. One evening, after an exhausting meeting, she sat alone in the office, rubbing her temples. Aisha walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Sandra. You're still here, Aisha noted. Sandra let out a dry laugh. Not by choice. Aisha smirked. That's where you're wrong. You did choose this. Sandra looked at her, frustrated. Did I really have a choice? Aisha took a sip of her coffee. You could have walked away. Sandra hesitated. Aisha was right. She had chosen to stay, to fight, to rebuild. A shift in power. Weeks passed. Slowly, painfully, Sandra began to adapt. She worked late, studied harder, and found herself paying attention in ways she never had before. She watched Aisha closely, not out of resentment, but out of admiration. Aisha never raised her voice. She never made rushed decisions. Every move was calculated, every choice deliberate. She controlled the boardroom without needing to dominate it. Sandra realized something she had never considered before. Power wasn't loud. It was silent. And that was why Aisha had won. The twist. One morning, Sandra was called into a high-level meeting. Investors, board members, senior executives, all present. Aisha gestured for her to sit next to her at the head of the table. Sandra stiffened. This was not her place. Not anymore. Aisha slid a file across the table. You're presenting today. Sandra's heart pounded. Me? Aisha nodded. You've been working on the financial strategy. Show them what you've learned. Sandra swallowed hard. The room was silent. All eyes were on her. She took a deep breath, opened the file, and began. As she spoke, something shifted. The nervousness faded. The room listened. She controlled the conversation. For the first time in her life, Sandra understood what true power felt like. And she owed it to the woman she once tried to destroy. Months had passed. The city hadn't changed, but Sandra had. The once glamorous, arrogant woman who had flaunted her wealth and power now moved with quiet awareness. She had seen the rise and fall of an empire, the one she thought she ruled. But now she understood. She had never truly owned anything. She stood outside a quiet cafe, sipping a simple black coffee. No expensive jewelry, no designer labels. Just a woman watching the city move. People rushed by, businessmen in tailored suits, socialites stepping out of luxury cars, the same crowd she once belonged to. Now, she saw them differently. She had once believed power came from wealth, from possessions, from the ability to control others. But she had been wrong. Power was something else entirely. Across the street, a familiar figure stepped out of a sleek black car. Aisha. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it. She wasn't loud, didn't need to be. People simply moved aside for her. No arrogance, no theatrics, just quiet control. And that was real power. Sandra exhaled, watching as Aisha walked into an office building. She didn't just own businesses, she owned influence. Not just material wealth, but the ability to shape the world around her without lifting a finger. And the most humiliating part? Aisha had known this all along. Sandra had been playing checkers. Aisha had been playing chess. Leonard's fall. Meanwhile, Leonard sat in a tiny, dimly lit office in the outskirts of the city. The man who once walked through skyscrapers with confidence now worked in a failing firm, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and outdated equipment. The world had moved on without him. A knock on his office door made him look up. His new boss stood there, arms crossed. "Mr. King, we need to talk about your performance." Leonard swallowed his pride. Once, he would have laughed at a conversation like this. He had been the one calling people into his office, deciding their fates. Now he was just another struggling employee, barely hanging on. He had been powerful once, or so he thought. But now, stripped of the wealth and status he had clung to, he saw how little control he had ever really possessed. He glanced at the dusty window, his reflection staring back at him. He looked older, worn down, defeated. He had spent years chasing money, chasing status, chasing things that could be taken away. And when they were gone, so was he. Aisha's return. That evening, Aisha stepped out of her car in front of the mansion. Her mansion, the place she had built, lived in, and almost lost. But she hadn't lost. She had simply waited. The massive doors opened as she walked inside. Everything was untouched, just as she had left it. The paintings, the sculptures, the warmth of the home. This wasn't just a house. It was her legacy. She paused at the grand staircase, looking around. So much had happened, but in the end, she remained. While others fought for control, she had quietly secured her place. While they had been loud, reckless, and short-sighted, she had been patient, deliberate, and strategic. A maid appeared in the hallway. "Welcome home, ma'am." Aisha smiled softly. "It's good to be home." She walked through the house, running her fingers along the furniture, the walls, the history of her life. Every corner of this home had a story. Every detail held a memory. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about roots, about stability, about the foundation she had built long before Sandra ever entered the picture. She stepped onto the balcony, looking out at the city skyline. This city had tested her, but she had won. And not through anger, not through desperation, but through wisdom. Sandra's understanding. Sandra continued watching Aisha from a distance. Not with hatred, not with jealousy, but with something new, understanding. She thought back to the day she had humiliated Aisha in the restaurant, thinking she had won. She had been blind then, obsessed with the thrill of the moment, never thinking about the future. Now she saw the truth. Aisha had never been weak. She had been patient. Sandra thought of all the things she had once cared about. The designer clothes, the expensive vacations, the elite parties where everyone whispered and gossiped. It had all seemed so important at the time. But now it felt empty. She had spent so much time trying to take what Aisha had, never realizing that what made Aisha powerful wasn't just money or property. It was something deeper. It was control over herself, control over her emotions, control over her future. Sandra sighed, finishing her coffee. She had lost, and there was no changing that. But maybe, just maybe, she had learned something along the way. Aisha's final move. The next morning, Aisha sat in her office, reviewing documents with quiet satisfaction. The empire was secure, the threats eliminated. And yet, she didn't feel the need to celebrate. This wasn't about victory. It was simply the inevitable result of playing the game well. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. King, there's someone here to see you." Aisha glanced up. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Sandra." Aisha raised an eyebrow, but remained composed. "Send her in." Sandra entered, no longer the arrogant woman she once was. There was no confidence in her stride, no smugness in her expression, just quiet acceptance. Aisha leaned back in her chair. "To what do I owe this visit?" Sandra hesitated, then finally spoke. "I get it now." Aisha nodded, waiting. Sandra took a deep breath. "You weren't just getting revenge, were you? You wanted to prove a point." Aisha gave a small smile. "Revenge is temporary. Lessons last longer." Sandra exhaled, shaking her head. "You really did plan everything." Aisha shrugged. "Not everything, just the things that mattered." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, Sandra did something she never thought she'd do. She extended her hand. Aisha looked at it, then shook it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. But it was something new. Understanding. Moral lesson. Never mistake kindness for weakness. True power is built quietly, not flaunted. Those who play the long game always win. If you found this story engaging, don't just watch, be part of the journey. Hit the like button to show your support, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and most importantly, subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And if you know someone who would enjoy this, share it with them, your friends, colleagues, and family.